Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Resolve Debate. And today we're going to discuss how to debate a disadvantage. So, first, we need to ask ourselves, why do you want to go for a disadvantage? The most simple answer is that they win a lot, because most disadvantages are either far faster than the AF or may have a greater magnitude than it. Good disadvantages turn the case, which is a fancy way of saying that they give you inroads into the AF's own offense. Second is that judges like them. Even if you can choose an easy win with a Fiat K or Michigan slot counterplans, they'd prefer to listen to strategies that are well researched and AF specific. They tend to reward you with not only more leniency, but also higher speaks. The third reason is the strategic flexibility that disadvantages offer you, because they give you a multitude of different block and tuner options. Here I have a list that you could potentially go for. I'm not going to read them all out to you, but you can see just the flexibility that Diaz give you and how you can combine them with other positions later in the debate. First, we need to revisit the parts of the disadvantage. I'm going to be pretty much assuming that you already have the basic idea of what each part is, but we'll review them really quick. First is uniqueness. This is just a snapshot of whether the interlink or the link of the disadvantage is happening right now in the status quo. One thing to note is that it's probabilistic, because even though the chances of a bill passing can be yes or no, it's rarely zero. That's why you're most likely winning a risk of the link at some point. Second is the link itself. This is just a reason why the affirmative causes the disadvantage. Obviously, it's very hard to zero it, and 0% risk the chance that the affirmative causes the DA. Therefore, our teams will go for shielding arguments to reduce its likelihood. Third is the internal link. Think about this like a bridge between the link and the terminal impact. For example, you'll see on the core quality disadvantage from last year that core backlogs undermine confidence in the rule of law, and that causes existential threats. That's an example of the internal link for you. Fourth is the impact. This is just how you get to extinction, and generally faster and larger impacts are better. But you'll want to make sure that similar events or similar internal links haven't happened before, otherwise the impact is thumped. Next, we have to discuss how to extend a disadvantage in the block. You'll want to begin with a short impact overview of about 20 to 30 seconds. Here you'll want to only reiterate the impact with 1NC evidence because you'll be doing the link work later on the line by line directly. Next, you want to do impact calculus. This is where you're analyzing the disadvantage using terms like time frame, magnitude, probability, and scope. Here you're essentially explaining why the disadvantage should come before the affirmative and why the judge should vote for it instead. First is time frame. This is pretty simple to understand, but there's several reasons why you should prefer it. First is that you can only die once, but other things, such as other steps and other people, might be able to intervene the impacts that the AF presents. This means earlier impacts control later impacts, but the inverse is not true. Second is magnitude. There's a big difference between 99.9% of people dying and 100%. The simple reason why is because even if 120 people survived a nuclear war, they could repopulate the Earth. But if every single person died, that's impossible. This is what we call reversibility. Third is probability. Typically, this is what soft left affirmatives will go for, and not many other affirmatives tend to go for this. Usually, on the negative, you want to argue that even if there's a higher probability of structural violence, extinction is so much worse that it's irrational to prioritize a slight increase in structural violence above higher magnitude impacts. Next is advanced impact calculus. Here you'll want to get more concrete using other terms and adjectives like inevitability, historicity and empirical examples, credibility, scope, and reversibility. Here's what we'll call the disjunctive-conjunctive distinction. Even if this sounds complex, this just means how many events have to happen until you get to the extinction impact for your disadvantage. Essentially, for the politics dissent, for example, you need to win one, that the bill is passing now. Second, the plan will cause the bill not to be passed. And third, the bill prevents a shutdown and funding the government. Fourth, that enables military readiness. Fifth, that deters China. And sixth, deterring China is key to prevent nuclear war. With each and every step you add in the disadvantages internal link chain, this is another event that you need to win that can potentially affect the disadvantage. Next, You can also read other impacts and cards that are different from the impact in the 1NC. Emphasis on different, because you don't want to be reading the same impact over again because they can cross-apply their impact defense. Next, you want to go to turns case. These are cards or analytics that say that the link or the internal link worsens the scenario or internal link that you think the affirmative is going for. Oftentimes, disad rounds are won and lost on turns case because this gives you innards into their offense. It makes it so that case is no longer external to the disadvantage, but you know that the disadvantage is external to case. This means there is a far higher risk of voting affirmative than the negative, which can mitigate existential risks. Here's where you have some options, because you can either do this right after the impact overview, still on the overview for the disadvantage, or on the link debate. There's some trade-offs here, because even though it increases the risk that your opponents might drop turns case, it also makes it harder to flow for the judge. So you need to keep this in mind. Ideally, this is 1 to 3 cards, depending on whether you're extending the disadvantage in either the 2NC or the 1NR. You'll want to use phrases like turns and encompasses to increase the scope of your offense and make the disadvantage subsume the AF scenarios and internal links. Ideally, your turns case should turn the AF at multiple levels, like the link, internal link, and impact. This makes the 1-year job so much harder because there's so many more moving parts that they need to contest in order to win against the disad. Next, you'll want to line by line the 2AC's answers. Usually the 2AC will number their answers like 1, no uniqueness, 2, no link, 3, no internal link. So you want to say 2AC1, yes uniqueness, 2AC2, yes link, etc. And then just use the 2AC1, 2AC2, etc. structure. This way, you can clearly signpost, extend 1AC cards and warrants, and then respond to the warrants in the 2AC's own cards, and then read more evidence. This is what we call the 3-to-1 rule, where you'll want to read 3 cards for every card the 2AC read on an individual argument. Because the 1NR has 13 minutes of prep, this means these are 13 minutes that your 1N can use to type out indicts to every single 2AC card, re-highlight their evidence, and get more evidence to read against it as well. Next, for uniqueness. This is like the 1NC uniqueness evidence, but you'll also want to use more analytics and storytelling here. You'll want to use phrases like recency controls, or because it factors in most recent events that you'll have to explain. And then you say that their evidence doesn't factor in these examples or pieces of evidence. Here, you'll want to craft a story. With the shutdown disadvantage, for example, we'd craft a story that was like, John Thune and Johnson in the House are trying to piece together Republican and GOP support in order to get a continuing resolution passed. However, the plan is perceived as a bolt from the blue that completely derails congressional negotiations, making it impossible to pass a continuing resolution. In this way, judges will have a story that they can latch onto and then be more amenable to your warrants on both uniqueness and the link debates that way. You'll want to pull specific warrants and examples from your own evidence and then compare them with evidence and warrants that your opponents read. If you're worried about the 1AR and the 2AR going for uniqueness, you can always argue that the link controls the direction of uniqueness. For example, even if you're uncertain whether the continuing resolution and congressional spending will get passed, you know that the plan makes that impossible, so there is only a risk of the negative's offense. Next is the link. This is where the majority of the debate will happen. First, you want to extend 1NC evidence like I explained earlier. Sometimes it's your best card, but sometimes not. Push back on yes-no framing that the AFO tried to go for, because it's not a yes-no question, but instead a probability of the link happening. For example, there's not a 20% chance of causing partisan fights, but it's just a risk of how big those fights are. You'll want to pull out strong wording from your cards. On the core card disadvantage from last year, a lot of cards said, quote, open the floodgates of litigation, or quote, atomic bomb on the entire patent system. Usually, 2ACs will read link turns to your disadvantage and say that the affirmative makes your scenario better. Here you want to do analysis of the link versus the link turn. You need to explain why the probability and magnitude of the link is larger. Next, you'll want to explain why uniqueness controls the direction of the link if you think that the 1AR and the 2AR are going for link defense, or the turn. For example, If you're debating the econ disadvantage, you'll want to argue that because you know that the economy is up right now, there is only a risk that the plan will worsen it. To get to a more advanced level with link debating, you'll also want to argue that the link alone turns the case. This is just explaining how the link can implicate solvency. I know it's stated now, but an example of the core quad disadvantage from last year would explain how high numbers of patent cases in the court system would make it impossible to adjudicate, which means that these patent disputes can't be resolved in the first place. Then you'd frame that in terms of their own internal links and impacts. Next is the interlink. For most disadvantages, this is the most single vulnerable part, and logically, this is where most DAs probably fall apart because on face value, they aren't that logical. Here, you'll want to leverage uniqueness to explain how every step of the interlink sets the brink for the disadvantage. Here, you'll want to use the language like rapidity and tipping points to frame this. You'll also want to pull specifics and examples from your own evidence to help prove that too. Ideally, you have not just one interlink, but ideally two interlinks into your disadvantage. This way, it gives you greater scope of offense, and if the 1AR goes for interlink defense, there's more moving parts that the 1AR will have to keep track of and refute. Next is the impact debating. For most disadvantages, this is their strongest part, and they're typically easier to win than the other three components. Versus generic impact defense, you want to explain that your evidence is contextualized to not only examples, but also your internal links. Ideally, the negative has the luxury of being ahead on evidence specificity. Some teams like to impact turn disadvantages, so be careful. Generally, these are not fun to deal with, but the same 3-to-1 negative card to 2AC card ratio applies. Yes, you can read new impacts, and I would recommend it, but make sure these aren't generic impacts like hegemony or others that can easily get impact turned. Democracy is especially susceptible to this, because this allows them to read new impact turns in the 1AR, which make your 2NR hell. Now, we can move on to going for a disadvantage in the 2NR. Here, you want to start the first 20 to 30 seconds off with judge instruction. Essentially, these are just reasons why you think that you won the round. Fundamentally, judges are people, and people are lazy, and they want an easy way out, and they'll usually take the easiest path to the ballot that you lay out. Treat them like smart 5th graders. They probably don't know the intricacies of the topic or anything else about the topic. But even if they're not smart, they think so. So if you appeal to that and just explain in concrete terms why you think you won the debate, they'll latch onto that. If, for example, the 1AR dropped an impact or turns case, you can explain how that means, quote, try or die flip snag. Essentially, this just means that if you don't try to remedy the disadvantage by not passing the plan, you will die. This means you can elevate the risk of your own offense through these ways. Next, you'll want to do the impact overview like you already did with the 2NC and the 1NR. Extend only 1 to 2 impacts here, and you'll want to do comparison of how it outweighs and turns the app's own scenarios. You'll also want to extend turns case. This is how the disadvantages accesses app's impacts and interlinks, as I explained earlier. You'll also want to do explicit comparison between AF and neg impacts. For example, if you're debating against a pandemic's AF, like NBA's biodefense AF, for example, you'll want to explain that, for example, permafrost thaw is very slow and disease spread is very low. They will not explain how many decades it will take for pathogens to develop, but you know by contrast that the continuing resolution is on the table now and military readiness can get imperiled now. That way you can do some good time frame impact calculus and explain why your own impacts outweigh. In the past, one of the tricks that my lab leaders have taught me is that you keep a living document of impacts extended in the 1AR. This is just a list of every single impact that the 1AR went for, and then you can do explicit analysis of how the disadvantage and your own interlink chain turns every single impact that the 1AR has tried to go for. Next, you'll want to refute arguments extended in the 1AR. You'll also want to do evidence comparison here. Even though you're not reading any new cards unless you're really in a bind, you'll want to extend your own argument. For example, with the Putin stability DA, you'll argue that Putin's regime is unstable now. That's Devyakin 24. Then you'll want to provide reasons why that's true, in which you'll need to reference both warrants and authors. For example, Putin still attracts vast oil rents that keep his oligarchs happy and him in power. That's Devyakin 24. Next, you'll want to explain why the app's own claims and warrants are wrong, and here's where the evidence comparison comes in. For example, you can say that their evidence doesn't assume Yevgeny Prigozhin's assassination, or you can say that your evidence is more rigorous, scientifically or otherwise. You'll also want to harp on evidence that they have dropped. Essentially, you can look at other parts of the disadvantage to see parts of evidence that you've read on other parts, like uniqueness and the link, can be cross-applied to other parts. For example, uniqueness and internal link often has a lot of overlap. If you're arguing that Putin's regime is on the brink now, but then the one AR is trying to argue that Putin's regime is stable, you can cross-apply your uniqueness evidence to prove why Putin's regime is on the brink and how he's trying to delicately balance the oligarchs versus the everyday members of civil society. And that's it. Thank you so much for listening and have a great day.